Ding, 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 ding.
Welcome to Talking Pictures Trivia, the podcast in which a group of Welcome to Talking Pictures Trivia, the podcast in which a group of
B-side. All right, hello and welcome back to B-side. We haven't done one of these in a while, and I'm really excited. Today we're going to be talking about short films. We just completed our episode on short films on the flagship show, and I'd like to kind of follow up with some details, with some thoughts I was having about those films, things that I don't think necessarily got filled in the flagship. What I'm going to talk about today is the sort of similarity I see between short story and short film, and the origins of short story and how I think that influences short film. So short stories really don't, as an independent form, independent from other literary forms, let's say like the novel, they don't come into being until I think it's the 1840s, with Nathaniel Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales. I'm so sure somebody can go check my date there. But it is around that time when Hawthorne publishes his Twice Told Tales, and a little later on we see Edgar Allan Poe and his various short stories. And of course Poe famously reviewed Twice Told Tales, giving both kind of positive and negative evaluations of it. And these two writers, Hawthorne and Poe, are kind of seen as the originators of the short story as an independent form. However, long before this, we see something like the short story arising in narratives central to oral tradition. So these are traditions in which tales and stories are passed on by word of mouth. And there's, usually a speaker of some sort who's performing the story for a group. And these stories tend to be very traditional in the sense that you are passing the same story down from parent to child and on through history. Most of literature is actually oral. Most of what we think of as great works are lost. They're from the word of mouth, and they've been lost. A few of them, though, get captured in religious texts, which, although very long, tend to be segmented, much in the way we believe the oral tradition was segmented. So you think of something like the Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And these are stories, more so the Mahabharata than the Ramayana, come off as a collection of stories that are tied together through an overarching plot, which is that these two groups of people are kind of at war with each other. We also see this in something like Homer, where Odysseus's adventures coming home, and then his adventures that he's recalling, and then the adventures that are in the present tense of the poem in which he's coming home are also, very, very segmented, right? He sees the Cyclops, he moves on to kind of the lotus flower incident, etc. They're like he lands in a place, something happens, he moves on, he lands in a place, something happens. We see this also very distinctly in Arabian Nights, where the organizing principle is Shahrazad is making up a new story, and the context, the content rather, of Arabian Nights is those stories. Now, personally, I think that reasons for this might be traced to the capacity of memory. These stories were spoken, and though, these are incredibly, the Mahabharata is incredibly long. The Arabian Nights are, decently long. It's a book-length thing. Yet these tales could be memorized and spoken, often by large groups. And I think that probably the reason why we have this sort of segmenting strategy is that it makes it easier to recall these tales if you are able to kind of break them up into digestible units. And there seems to be some evidence that indicate as much. And of course, there's also rules about how you tell these things. We see this with Buddhist and Indian tradition, where supposedly the descriptions of something, I think, ran from the shortest to the longest word in terms of adjectives that would describe something. So there are these rules also that accommodate story structure, but I imagine these kind of longer tales do benefit from the kind of segmenting, right? And so so you have a tale kind of accommodating memory and then being passed on. Now, when novels first started appearing in the late 16th century, they too had the characteristic of being a collection of disparate narratives drawn together by an organizing principle. And even before the 16th century, we could see this. And you could think of like the Decameron of 1353, Boccaccio's The Decameron, in which we have a collection of stories being told by a group of people who have left the city-state, I think it's Florence, in order to avoid the Black Plague, and they've gone off away from the city, and now they're telling these stories. And so the Decameron is really a short story collection with a plague-based organizational principle. And the Canterbury Tales, published in written circa 1400, is also a short story collection that also has an organizing principle. A group of pilgrims are going to see a shrine to St. Thomas a la Becket. And initially, when we get into the 18th century, where we start to see novels, as novels become more sophisticated, they move from kind of random events to something which we might call the picaresque. And the picaresque genre is sort of where we follow one hero and he or she goes around from place to place and has an adventure. Again, we could see the short story-ness of this genre, right? It may be the same hero, but he kind of wanders around England, as Tom Jones does, and has a collection of events. Now, happen to him. Now, these events in Henry Fielding's novel, Tom Jones, they end up sort of working together, right? And you end up having, like, events that happen at the beginning are recalled later in the story, and there's a nice bow that wraps everything up that harkens back to earlier parts in the plot. So by the time we get to Tom Jones, things are getting more sophisticated in longer form storytelling. However, it seems to still be evolving out of this kind of short, digestible narrative. We get later into the 18th century, you get people like Jane Austen, and the novel as a long-form narrative really takes on its own characteristic, right? It takes on, it's a new thing. I mean, it's novel, right? The word literally means, kind of something new and unique. And you can see like the works of Jane Austen are very different from the works that came before. And the works of Frances Burney, another example, very different. There's sort of a continuous story that has a character who goes through a series of changes, who reaches a climax. There's a peripeteia, a shift in their fortunes. Then things wrap up and conclude, but it's the still single arch that that this character goes through, that they develop, and it's all connected together. It feels more unified. All right. So now moving into short films. So short films were films when films were initially developed, and if you look at the early films of Edison, if you go into the Museum of the Moving Picture in Astoria, Queens, you could see a lot of the short films of Edison, and they're great. There's these little things. There's Eugene Sondal, the bodybuilder posing. There's a boxing match that you could see part of. There is, I think he stages a Shakespeare play, but I don't remember which one. but they're short. They're little moments. They're tricks. You think of the Lumiere brothers, who had the famous train riding at the audience, which I think we've talked about before on the podcast. Or Georges Méliès, his films are also kind of these short special effect spectacles. But in all cases, these things are spectacles, right? They're one-reelers, which means it's about 12 minutes, I would say, in silent film. And they're usually tricks, right? So Méliès developed special effects, and a lot of his films were they had stories. It's not that they didn't have stories, but they were more or less concerned with the observation of an effect, even with things that are more narrative based. So I saw a collection of silent Shakespeare. So it was, I think, like Shakespeare films made before 1912, and they're you know they're like a few scenes in Shakespeare. I think the only thing that survived of the version of King John was King John sitting on a throne. So, it's not a medium that is yet particularly good for something like Shakespeare, which has or drama generally, right? Because technology required films to be short, and filmmakers at this time were usually more inventors than artists, though I know these things shouldn't always be separated into two separate categories. But for now we'll do that. Inventors thought no one would want to watch a movie more than an hour in length, never mind 2 or 3 hours. Like the short story of the oral tradition, the short film of the early days of cinema developed because of the limits of technology. And so you couldn't just continuously film. You'd have to change the reels, and people were concerned that this would try human patience, right? They'll go to the theater for a long time, but nobody's going to want to sit through a silent collection of pictures for quite that long. Okay. Of course, the movies we're watching today, the movies we watched in the podcast, Time Code, Electric Labyrinth, and Street of Crocodiles, these films aren't restrained by technology. They're all made after 1960. Time Code is made in 2017. They are restrained by their budgets, and I'll get into that a little more, but they don't have the same restraints that shaped short films in the late 19th and early 20th century. But just as Hawthorne and Poe, I would argue, borrowed from an older tradition to shape a new genre, the short story, so too do these three filmmakers and these three films borrow from their forebears to revive an older form. Or maybe I should say they employ an older form in a new way. And so what do I mean by that? Well, in order to kind of unpack what I mean by employing an older form in a new way, I want to again jump into short fiction. And my example here is O. Henry's The Gift of the Magi. Now, The Gift of the Magi is probably the most famous of the O. Henry stories. And O. Henry is known as a short story writer for people who don't know him. But this is a very quick story about a man and a woman married, and the man's wife has this beautiful hair, and he wants to give her a comb so she can comb her beautiful hair. And he has this prized pocket watch, and he sells that. He pawns it to get money to buy a comb. His wife, who loves her husband, very devoted, cuts her hair off and sells it in order to get money to buy a chain for the pocket watch. And so when it comes to exchanging presents, you see here that that he gives her a comb for hair that isn't there anymore, and she gives him a chain for a pocket watch, which isn't there. And what we get from that story is a sort of singular irony, right? Captured purely in the character's actions. And it highlights just that one irony. This idea of kind of making a sacrifice for your significant other. And O. Henry maybe offers additional commentary on that irony, and he does, and he compares it to the gift of the Magi in the story of the birth of Christ. But what we're concerned here with is the single action and the single relatively simple irony. Yeah? Poe, in his review of Twice Told Tales that I mentioned before, he accused Hawthorne of over-reliance on allegory. So short fiction in these cases, here in the case of the Magi, Gift of the Magi, and in Poe's observations about Hawthorne, we see that short fiction is known for presenting either a single, often expressed as universal irony, or it presents an allegory, a sort of a thing we have to learn and take away. I would say, though not allegorical, short films do much of the same thing as short fiction, although we tend to rely more on irony than allegory. I think allegory is something that really just doesn't survive particularly well in the modern world. So the short films, they centralize a single action or category of action. They can retain a sort of abridged three-act structure, certainly, but they don't have to. They can have rich characters, but they don't have to. Plot, or rather plot as a single action or irony, takes over the short film. Or maybe we should say it inspires it. These are not stories of heroes called on journeys. These are stories of a step, a trip, a mistake, a dance, a sprint, a sight. We could say the short film modulates even between photograph, that's the action at absolute stasis, and film, the entire duration of an action. Because the short film, unlike the photograph, cannot freeze time. But the short film also isn't a history. And that's not due to the length of time a short film covers. I mean, you think of Oedipus Rex, it's a play that takes place in one day, but that drama is a history. It's about the destruction and revival and destruction again of Thebes, the rise and fall of a great man, the history of a family, the history of a psyche, the history of fate, etc. The short film, because of its length, not because of the time it covers, but because of the shortness of it, it isn't a history then, right? It's a Nickelodeon, it's a dime watch, a single memory. And these three films, again, they were in order of release: Electric Labyrinth, the short film and University of Southern California film project of George Lucas, the Street of Crocodiles, the film directed by the Quay brothers, and then the 2017 Oscar live action short nomination, Time Code. And each one of them kind of feels like a Nickelodeon in its own right. They isolate a single aspect of film. They bring forward a single and simple irony that is very can be very O. Henry-like. I think the most O. Henry-like is the last film, Time Code. Time Code is about a parking garage and the security guards who work there. And there's Luna and Diego, and I believe Diego works the overnight shift and Luna the day shift. And they kind of trade off over and over again. And what Luna discovers about Diego is that he loves to, when walking the floors of the parking garage, dance. And so what she does is she leaves a note for him telling him what camera and at what time, and then she dances in front of the camera. And then he does the same thing. And they have this relationship that develops through Post-it notes and video recording of them dancing. And even though they exchange some words, they say hello and goodbye when they trade ships, but they never reference the actual dancing. And so it ends with them dancing together. And that's the sort of almost meet-cute aspect of Time Code. Move on to Electric Labyrinth. Electric Labyrinth is a climax. It's a guy who is escaping this, what appears to be an underground, somewhat maybe authoritarian, it's unclear, authoritarian government. Street of Crocodiles from the Quay brothers is the image of a nightmare. It's a setting, it's a place, and in it we see the dusty, the dilapidated, the inanimate objects of this world suddenly filled up with a vitality and coming to life. Of these three films that we covered for today's podcast, for the podcast on the flagship, I would say that Street is somewhat different, as it isn't concerned with these kind of ironies or character, really. Street seems to be more concerned with setting. I mean, the movie is about the spirit and disease of a place. And the film's setting is animated, alive, unsettled, hissing. It's a place that has that's populated by these kind of puppets, and these puppets are in various dilapidated states. There seems to be a sort of thin puppet shaped like an old man who wanders around. There's a little boy who captures a pet screw, and then there's a collection of these four puppets without the tops of their heads with glowing eyes, and it's intensely creepy, but it's this feeling of location, of a kind of a broken down location. And yeah, so I think for that reason, it feels a little different. It feels like the isolation of setting more from action, because even the major action of Street of Crocodiles is hard to identify. I couldn't tell you even now what it is, other than at one point the puppets sort of pull the head off of the older man, and then they rearrange his body, but it doesn't build anything. It just sort of, the movie fades away. But what we see with the other films is the kind of isolation of a moment. And with Electric Labyrinth, you see the isolation of the climax, right? It's the guy about to escape, about to break free. And the entire movie, all 15 minutes of it, is him sort of running down hallways, and there's sound that's hard to pick out. It's hard to understand what people are saying. It's very fuzzy. Little words come through here and there. But really what it's about is about a man about to break free, right? About to break free from the society, and the credits, we see him running into the sunset. So he's gotten out of the labyrinth. But I think Time Code, more than anything, really captures this kind of, this feel of the oral tradition that is inherited from the short story, right? And I think that with Time Code, we really see the kind of this little irony of how two people meet, right? And it's a contemporary idea, the meet cute, which is a term people use in romantic comedy for how the main pair gets together, right? And in the case of Time Code, what we see with the meet cute is that convention is presented in a new way. And I don't think there's any particular commentary on that convention. I don't think we could say that it's condemning the meet cute. I think rather Time Code is celebrating the meet cute, if anything. But I think that one action is given an ironic spin. And that's what makes this story, this one action, this segment, which is kind of fun and different, yet hearkening to something familiar. I think it makes Time Code feel almost like it's echoing something from an older oral tradition, just because it is short, it's segmented, and it exaggerates and reflects our own culture and the something in our culture, in this case, kind of the romantic meeting of people, a couple, a man and woman meeting. And I think that's why I say time code really feels like it is resting on the top of this kind of short film tradition that links back to oral tradition. Or anyway, that's my argument. Well, I see Street of Crocodiles doing something really different, which is it's a celebration of setting. And even celebration is the wrong word. It's an examination of setting. Because I'm not entirely sure how celebratory the Quays are about this place. All right. Very good. So thank you for tuning in. And this has been B-Side.